Hi, I'm Joe Saunders with Miniature Landscape Hobbies, and in this episode, I'm going to cover my guide to acrylic layer painting. This is a very old style of painting, but it's still your best and most versatile option. That means that acrylic layer painting is an essential skill for both beginning painters and advanced painters. Let's go over it in detail. Miniature Landscape Hobbies is proudly supported by these sponsors. Layer painting goes, unsurprisingly, in layers. These layers are often described as this. First the primer layer, then the base color, next midtones, highlighting, sometimes filters, washes, or glazes, lining in and pin washes, and finally varnishes. Now this is only a very general list. Some steps will have multiple parts. For instance, midtones could actually have plenty of different layers involved. Despite this, you won't see a lot of variation on any one of these steps, except for maybe filters, washes, and pin washes. Let's dive into it and take these steps one by one. I'd like to take a quick moment to thank my Patreon supporters. Without their assistance, Miniature Landscape Hobbies would not be possible. If you would like to learn more about the benefits of becoming a Patreon supporter, please check the link in the video description. First up is the primer layer. We can prime our models by a rattle can, airbrush, or brush, and this is done for a fairly simple reason. Paint sticks to itself a lot better than it sticks to the metal, plastic, or resin of the model itself. So a smooth primer layer is essential. The primer layer is usually made with black, gray, or white paint. The color you choose is actually quite important. Layer painting is almost always done from dark colors to light colors, so the primer will aid in the overall vibrancy of the model. The lighter the primer, the more the colors will stand out. Don't always assume, though, that white is the best. Contrast is essential with miniatures, so sometimes you'll want to start with black to make the shadowy areas look more dramatic. Ultimately, the color you choose to undercoat a model with is up to you, and you'll hear endless debates on the topic. I'm a firm believer that if you're going to do rank and file models, you should start with black, so as to simplify the shading element. But for character models, I'll sometimes use a dark gray. I encourage you to explore the options here for yourself. Try all the different combinations of colors and settle on the primer that you like. The base color is the darkest shade of a color that you want to use on the part of the model that you're going to layer over. As I mentioned, layer painting is done darkest to lightest, so the base color will be what you'll see in the deepest folds of a model's clothing or in its shadowy areas. In my example, I'm painting the Duke of Wellington by Wargames. His cloak is going to be a light shade of blue, so I'm going to start with a deep navy color. When I'm finished, the navy will really only show where the light isn't hitting the cape directly, but it'll provide a substrate color that will complement the color layers going over top of it. Midtones are the layers that build on the base color, getting gradually lighter as you approach the edges of a detail or as you approach the areas of the model most exposed to light. I've gone into the theory behind how light works with models in another video, so I'll put a link up for your reference. But basically what we're doing here is compensating for the fact that light collects differently on small objects than on large ones. We want to exaggerate the shadows by making them proportionally darker. This will simulate the fact that the real-world version of whatever you're painting is large enough to cast its own shadows. To do all this effectively, you'll need to consider the direction of the light source that you're implying is illuminating the model. My suggestion here is that 99% of the time, you should just assume the light is coming from straight above the model. As we're talking mainly about wargaming here, environmental effects are less of a concern than, say, with a diorama. With a diorama, you'll definitely want to consider if the lighting that's in the subject's vicinity is coming from a certain direction, and how this might change its appearance. The actual layers of the midtones are really just done by adding increasingly larger amounts of a lighter color to the base color and painting it outwards from the darkest layers, ending up lightest at the edges. I'm adding a light blue to my navy here to make the cloak look brighter on the raised areas. Paint consistency is pretty important at this stage. You can add more thinner or water to the mix to increase the translucence of each subsequent layer. This will make the layering almost invisible to the eye, although most of the time 2 or 3 layers are all you really need. If you think the transitions between the layers look too sharp, don't stress a whole lot. We'll fix this later with washes and glazes. Before we leave this stage, please understand, if you're a beginner, mastering good midtones takes a practiced eye and a whole lot of work on brush techniques. You'll not be able to will yourself to be good at this step, but you must learn it through practice. Don't worry though, we've all had to tackle this, and any experienced painter should be happy to lend you help if you need it. Highlighting is next. This is the process of making the very most prominent parts of the model look like they are in direct light. This is also the element of traditional layer painting that takes a bit of a leap of faith. Why? Well, in order to highlight well, you usually have to exaggerate the brightness of the highlight itself. Generally, the smaller the model, the more exaggerated the highlight will be. For this reason, I suggest you change your perspective when viewing your model periodically. Hold it out at arm's length when you apply your highlights so you can get a better impression of what you're getting. Up close, your colors often just won't look right, so you need to take the viewer's perspective to see what you're actually creating. To apply the highlight itself, you need to take your lightest midtone and make it even brighter. Then you can lightly brush this onto the most extreme edges of the model's details. The technique for this usually is done with a fine brush, working with the tip, or better yet, if the model permits it, by running the side of the bristles around the detail's edges. Sometimes you can also apply the highlight by dry brush if you're working with a heavily textured surface. Before we move on from highlights, I need to caution you about using white paint. The logical way to make your midtones really bright would be to, of course, add white. But white tends to make your highlights very pastel, which typically doesn't look right. But, of course, this would depend on your subject. For this reason, lighter grays or beiges are a good option to mix into your midtones, although this might not occur to beginning painters. In the example we've been following, I wanted the Duke of Wellington's jacket to be subtly different in color from his blue cloak, so I added a pale yellow to the blue midtones. This resulted in a nice bright highlight that wasn't too pastel, but still worked with the previous layers. Now we find ourselves at filters, washes, and glazes. This is kind of a catch-all classification for a series of techniques and products that rectify any number of issues you might face in the earlier painting stages. Of course, this step is optional, because if you've layered nicely and chosen your colors well, there may not be anything to fix. But more often than not, 1 or 2 of these tricks will be needed on your work. Filters, or filtering, is a process borrowed from scale modeling. This involves taking a very transparent color that complements all of your previous layers and brushing it on over top. When it dries, the subtle tint it adds will make the gradients between the colors more natural. This classically applies on camouflage, where two colors next to each other can be kind of visually discordant. Applying a filter subtly shifts them into line by adding a common tone. This is often called unifying the colors. Products for filtering are usually enamel-based, as this produces the right consistency to apply over a model's surface without accumulating in the recesses. Of all the techniques in this class, filters will likely be something you rarely use, but when you need it, you'll be glad to know about it. Washes are pretty much the opposite of filters. This is when you mix up a shade closer to your base color, thin it with either acrylic thinner or water, and brush it on the surface of your model after all your midtones and highlights are done. Gravity and capillary action will pull the wash into the recesses, darkening everything and creating more shadows. This will also play down sharp highlights. A wash will unify colors to a certain extent too, but this isn't the purpose. Washes are really for restoring depth to a model's details where it might have been disrupted by your layering. Washes come in pre-made varieties, or you can mix them yourself. Some are brush-on, some have to be applied by airbrush. If in doubt, try Army Painter shader washes. These have never let me down and are fairly common in stores. Glazes are kind of a halfway point between washes and filters. A glaze is made by thinning a midtone with water or a purpose-made thinner until you have a very transparent, slightly tinted mixture. Then you can just go ahead and brush this over your previous layers. Often a glaze will require several applications. The purpose of a glaze is to repair any chalky paint residue left on your surface from dry brushing by tinting over it. This can also help conceal brush strokes visible in the paint in order to promote a smooth appearance. And of course, a glaze will subtly unify your layers too. Glazes are specific to your midtones and would look like a bottle of water or thinner if you went to buy one, so there really aren't any pre-made options. If you can drop water into paint until it's almost clear, you can make a glaze, so don't worry about going shopping for one. If you do this though, add a drop of dish soap or airbrush flow improver to the mix to help break the water surface tension. That way it'll glaze much better. Lining in and pin washes are the way in which you establish even more contrast by outlining specific details on your models so they stand out. Not everyone uses lining in or pin washes. If you can build really striking layers going from dark to light, then you may not need this step. I am, however, a major proponent of lining in because, in my opinion, a good model has its shadows exaggerated as well as its highlights. Remember, when it comes to painting small things, contrast is king. Lining in involves taking a dark brown or black paint, thinning it until it flows, and then using a small brush to paint it in around the details on a model. My preferred way to do this is to mix 50-50 black paint and black acrylic ink. Sometimes I also add a drop of airbrush flow improver to help it flow nicely. Then with a superfine brush, like a 000, I go to work. This step honestly terrifies a lot of new painters, as brush control is strictly required to pull this off. It also takes a long time to do on most models, as you literally have to outline almost everything on the surface of your subject. My advice on this is just to get to work. The only way to master brush control is practice, and the time you spend will be worth it, as the contrast you build will produce next level results. There are a few products for lining in out there, but black paint and ink are both dirt cheap and common, so I just go with these. Pin washing does exactly the same thing as lining in, so you won't need to do both techniques on the same model. Pin washers differ though in that they use enamel or oil-based paints to outline the details. there are plenty of specific products to help with this step. I usually use a Tamiya black panel liner, but there are any number of colors and options for you to check out. In order to pin wash your models, you should use a satin or gloss varnish over your previous layers first. Spray this on and let it dry. The varnish will protect your previous work and assist your chosen product to flow around the details. After you apply the varnish, take out your lining product and with a fine brush, dab it into the surface near the details. Capillary action will help the product flow into place, creating perfect shadows. Since these products are oil-based, you can always erase any mistakes later with a brush moistened with thinner. Now I hear you say, why use pin washes? With all these extra steps and required products, they seem kind of inconvenient. Well, pin washes are actually faster to do and more forgiving than tracing everything with a brush. For this reason, when I'm batch painting or doing models with very tiny details, I use a pin wash. Otherwise, I fall back on good old-fashioned lining in. And finally, we come to the varnish step. Since we're primarily talking about wargaming, our carefully layered models will be subject to wear and tear as they're moved around on the game table. Of course, we therefore want to prevent any damage. So, cap off the painting process with a couple layers of varnish. You can use a rattle can, brush application, or airbrush. It doesn't really matter. But don't skip this step, unless for some reason you like to repaint your models or like the look of badly chipped game pieces. You can use satin, gloss, or matte varnishes depending on the look you prefer. Popular convention has it that gloss and satin varnishes are stronger wearing than matte ones, so I'll often spray a model with satin or gloss first, and then follow up with a coat of matte to reduce the shine. So there you have it, my essential guide to acrylic layer painting for wargaming models. This is of course a huge and varied topic that could literally take up many videos, but this overview should be useful to anyone who enjoys picking up a paintbrush. If you think I've missed any important details, be sure to mention it in the comments below, or better yet, share your own tips. If you'd like to learn more about the theory behind miniature painting, please watch this video, or watch this other video instead. Thanks for watching, and until next time, remember to keep building life in miniature.